Dave Tenzer is an old friend of mine. David is an entertainment lawyer, talent manager, and business consultant with extensive experience in many sectors of the media industry, including branded entertainment, sponsored programming, and product integration. He's currently managing director of the Personality and Lifestyles division at Generate, which is a management, entertainment, and marketing company with offices in Santa Monica and New York. He maintains his own entertainment law practice law office of David Tenzer. Please welcome, for a great panel, David Tenzer. Thank you. See you later. Okay.
Thank you very much. Once again, we're talking about the art of the deal, so let's jump right in here. We have a diverse and interesting panel today. To my immediate left is Lisa Callif, partner at Donaldson and Callif, named by Variety as one of the best and the brightest in 2011, an entertainment attorney whose primary focus is on representing independent filmmakers in all aspects of filmmaking. She, I think, is one of the preeminent fair use experts in the country. In addition to her work with independent film, she's one of the few attorneys in Los Angeles to represent live theaters. Prior to working with Michael Donaldson, she spent 4 years at Proskauer Rose, and she is now also an adjunct professor at Southwestern Law School. To Lisa's left is a colleague of mine, Devin Carbaugh, currently the manager of business and legal affairs at Entertainment One in Los Angeles. Prior to his position at eOne, he worked for Sony Pictures Television for over 6 years, where he was part of the business affairs team that worked on hit shows such as Damages, Justified, and Necessary Roughness. He also worked in production and reality and scripted television prior to Sony. And in addition, and I didn't know this until just within the last 24 hours, he had a brief acting career, hopefully it will still continue to go, including bit parts in the films Miss Congeniality, Spy Kids, and The Beautiful Country. And if we have some time later, perhaps Devin will tell us about his combined box office gross, foreign and domestic, for those films. To Devin's left is Mark Netter, Vice President of Business Development at BLITZ, a friend and an expert and really a pioneer in digital and social media marketing. He started out as a music supervisor on 3 Olympics broadcasts, worked for directors and producers on 3 features, produced video games, including Tetris, which is pretty cool, and as a business development executive, built the digital arm of Deadline Advertising, did licensing and ad sales for Xanel, and covered the West Coast for social media agency New Media Strategies. And to his left, just to make it completely symmetrical, we have another Tenzer on the panel.
The Tenzer bookends.
Exactly right. A beloved cousin Stuart. Often Michael Tenzer's on this panel, but our baseball card litigation has gotten out of hand recently, and so he felt he really couldn't be here today and might come to blows. Stuart has a long career as a lawyer and a business affairs executive. He was at Stephen Cannell Television for many years, then went to William Morris and then William Morris Endeavor for over 15 years. And he is the founder of Coast Road Media and is now lawyering and selling and packaging and doing all sorts of interesting things that we'll hear about today. So the tradition of this panel is that we always start out with 3 quotes to just kind of get the brain cells moving for those of you who haven't been properly caffeinated. First quote today. Just give me 25 guys on the last year of their contracts. I'll win a pennant every year. Can we have the next slide? And that comes from Sparky Anderson, one of the great baseball managers of all time. Our second quote. I don't want to be just a voice on the phone. I have to get to know these guys face to face and develop a sincere relationship. That way, if we run into problems in a deal, it doesn't get adversarial. We trust each other and have the confidence we can work things out. A lot of wisdom in that. And that comes from Wayne Huizinga, the sports and media entrepreneur, who essentially created Waste Management and then Blockbuster, 2 roll-ups that he did about 20 or 25 years ago, and the rest is history. And then the final quote, money doesn't make you happy. I now have $50 million, but I was just as happy when I had $48 million. And believe it or not, that quote comes from the former governor of California, an iconic image that I'm sure you all represent. I don't need to say his name. So And we should get that image off because it'll be completely distracting. So here's each year we sort of talk about different aspects of negotiating and documenting deals. And one of the things we sort of realized in putting this panel together today is that coming into a room and talking about the art of the deal kind of assumes that there is a deal to negotiate and document and go back and forth on. And one of the things, especially given the audience, that we thought we would spend some time on before we get into that today, all the blocking and tackling of making deals, is sort of, if you're starting in your career, if you're an independent filmmaker or an emerging talent of some kind, either in the traditional media space or in the digital space, how do you get a deal so that you can actually negotiate it? Which is to say, how do you sell your project? How do you move your career forward? And I thought it would be a good idea. There's a very diverse panel today, lawyers and people that are representing talent and people from traditional and digital media. I wonder if we can just kind of go down the row and talk a little bit about sort of that first job that you get in the business, the first project that you sell in the business. How do you do that? Because I imagine that there's a lot of interest in that part of it as well. And what I would say, by the way, is that these panels traditionally work better when we're all very interactive with one another. So we're going to be interrupting one another and talking over each other just like Vice President Biden did. But in addition, I think we'll have questions at the end. But if you have questions for us, feel free to raise your hand and let's make it a dialogue. So, Lisa, let's talk about kind of how do you get to the place where you actually break into the business and have a deal to negotiate?
Well, I'm happy you're asking the hardest question at the beginning, because then we can get it over with and the rest of the panel will be easy. But it is really the hardest thing. How do you break in? And everybody always asks that question. I think if you ask 10 different people, they'll have 10 different answers. And my answer, because I get it routinely, we represent a lot of first-time producers, is to go through the doors that are open, or at least a little bit ajar. People think there has to be this way. I have to get an agent. He has to submit my script. They have to do this. And there's not. As most of us in here knowing, you guys are all independent in some nature. Projects get made a million different ways, and it's always different. And so I think it's important to look at what your strengths are, who your connections are, what avenues you have to explore, and go that route and let the pieces fall as they may, rather than thinking there's this one way that's gonna make it happen. And of course, networking and being at events like this and joining organizations that have people and mentor programs and other people that are interested in the same thing you are is just key. I mean, it's just the relationships are very important, which you probably all heard a good jillion times, but I think because it's true, we all say it.
When you say go through the doors that are open, which I think is a really good way to put it, the idea is to sort of kind of have your game plan, but be prepared to pivot or sort of turn left or turn right, as the case may be?
Right, and not think you're like, oh, I need an agent, but I don't know any agents in Los Angeles, but that's what I need. But meanwhile, maybe your neighbor's a manager, and maybe they represent talent, and you're a writer, and they don't really do writers, they just do actors. But that's the door that's open to you, and you should ask that person and then see where they can lead you and that kind of thing, and not think that there's just one way that you need to have this person on your team or you need to have that person. Like, look at what your resources are and who you have access to.
And is networking, you always sort of hear about networking, but I'm assuming that you think that networking is as important as everybody else seems to think it is?
I do. If everyone else thinks it's really important, then I think the same.
Yes, okay, all right, fair enough. Devin, you work at Entertainment One, which is one of the sort of the really well-known and successful mini majors in the television business, and coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, a client of mine. We work together on eOne. I'm curious. eOne, a mini major as opposed to sort of a real major studio like a Fox or a Disney. Is it easier to get a project in the door at eOne? Are there less layers to be concerned about? And is it therefore sort of a better place for someone at the beginning of their career to be sort of focusing on?
Absolutely. I think there are less layers. Having come from recently onto eOne from Sony Pictures Television, it was a massive company that did a lot of business, and they were split the layers there are split into comedy, drama, and reality. Whereas at eOne, we don't really split it up like that. We just split it into scripted versus reality, and it's really accessible for creatives to come in and speak with our guys, because they're more, I don't know, they're real guys. They have in-depth knowledge of different types of media throughout the world. Since we're such a global company, we have offices in Toronto, New York, Nashville, Benelux, all over. They really try to focus on the creative aspect. I know, working for larger companies, you can get really caught up into the corporate side of things. eOne's not really that way. We've got different shows on the air. We have Hell on Wheels on AMC. We have Rookie Blues on, I believe it's on ABC. Rogue, which is on DirecTV, and Haven. So we have all these different platforms and different diverse type of networks that are actually we're developing things for. As far as your question goes on, is it more accessible? Absolutely. You're going to have to go through your agent to get to us. So good luck with that one and getting an agent. But as you were saying, there are doorways right around you, or your neighbor, or I want to dovetail back into what you said. Like my way that I got into the industry was like I worked for a producer she was very prolific, and she was, forgive my French, a hard ass. But she taught me, and she taught me, and she taught me, and then I eventually went into like the business side of the business instead of doing production work. And she was truly, like, I was right out of college, and she was my way into the business. So,
I have a question for you. You brought up that I actually think I know the answer to. I tell people something, but I'm not sure if I'm exactly right on it. But a lot of times, studios will always say you need to submit with an agent or a lawyer, and then they'll call me cold and say, will you represent me, because I need you to write a cover letter so I can get my script in. Now, I always think, and I say no, because one, we don't really do that, and two, I don't serve that purpose, and I think someone pitching your materials needs to be really 100% dedicated to pitching your materials, not just a lawyer you pay some money to write a letter to. Right. But I feel like that's an out. I think that if somebody has a relationship and they like your material, like the idea, they will read it. And if they don't really like it, that's their out to say, oh, you need to get a lawyer to put a cover letter on there. And that's kind of been my thinking, but I don't work in the studio.
I agree. I mean, it's sad to say, but it is really who you know in this town. It's like you can circumvent an agent if you know somebody in a studio system or something like that. But I try to stay away from that, just because it just, once you do a favor for somebody, it's like they always keep coming back to you to do that. But I think it's best if you do use an attorney, or
Right.
No, I was just going to add one thing. We've sort of proceeded on the premise that getting an agent is tough, and it is in the television world and the motion picture world. But since we're in a digital milieu here, the bright side of the story is all the agencies, all the big agencies, all the CAA, William Morris, all the biggies, and all the way down, they all now have some young agent whose job, or at least 50% of his job, his or her job is to scour the internet and find what's out there, and find who's the next YouTube star, who's getting hits, on all these different social media platforms. So rather than, David and I and a lot of us on this panel, we come from TV or motion picture backgrounds where you're not going to go make your own motion picture and see who picks it up, or you're not going to go make your own television show. That's not the way it's done. But if you can put out a 2 or 3 minute clip, even whether it's 30 seconds, if it gets buzz on some digital platform, somebody's going to find it. So the key is to get your material out there if it's something you can do on spec. And I guess really the point I wanted to make is that's the one area, that being the sort of the digital content space, where the agents are looking for you. It's not about going to MIPCOM, it's not about going to NAPD, it's not the traditional sales process. They're out there looking for you. So if you can get your stuff out there and seen, make sure they know how to get in touch with you. because every one of these agencies does have people whose job it is to find 15 of these folks a week. And there is a great deal of attention paid. So it's not all a negative scenario. The agency side or getting an agent on the digital side is not as difficult as one might think.
Yeah, and I don't know if is this on? Okay. Yeah, I had an experience. You mentioned working on Tetris. So when I left the Tetris company, I was able to get away with an option for a pretty significant period of time to try to sell Tetris as a television game show. And this is a little while back, so it was sort of a radical idea, I guess, at the time, or slightly. And I partnered with somebody here who had an interactive TV company that was kind of folding because the economy was not in great shape. And he had an agent that literally went with us on our first day of meetings, not even the first full day, did not pay attention in the meetings, spent a lot of time on his BlackBerry. And then after that, we did all the calls and the connections ourselves. And I had never done business development before. It's actually what self-taught me how to do it so that I could then do it in moving into digital marketing afterwards. And the things that I learned that I think are really important is, well, we had a license, so that got us in the door, but then we would say, well, what else are you looking for? And what I found was that if you go into a production company, which is helpful to be able to get into a network, or if you go to a network directly, even if they don't want to buy what you have that day, if you're presenting something that's germane, that's professionally done, if you're engaging in the room, if there's a conversation, they'll meet with you again. You just always have to make sure that you're always bringing something of value. And I think that to Stuart's point, one of the things we learned is that ideas are cheap, and execution is everything. There's a phrase in Hollywood, execution dependent. So if you can make part of what you're doing, if you can make a whole pilot, anything that you can do to kind of show that you can do it is a big deal. And otherwise, it really helps to partner with an existing producer who believes in what you're doing and will take probably more of the value of what you're doing than you want or expect. But you have to be able to show that you actually can do it, because we started pitching other reality ideas and other reality shows, and at a certain point we could just sort of call somebody up and say the idea, and they would tell us that's already being done at FX, or this is just being done over there. So I think that the kind of lessons I learned is, as much as possible, make it yourself, and in this day and age you can get attention for what you make. Don't be afraid to make those calls yourself and connect and network. I know it's not everybody's natural state, but just always make sure that whenever you do it, you're bringing something of value, so that even if somebody says no, they know that you didn't waste their time.
I find that when I sell a project, and when I was spending more of my time actually selling projects, one of the things that really drove me crazy, this is post-CAA, because if you're at a big agency, it's just an easier thing to do. But post-CAA, where you don't have that platform going for you, what sort of drove me crazy was that it was incredibly random. You would call up production company A, and you'd just get completely shut down, or you have to sign a submission release and give away all your rights or whatever. But at the same time, you could also call production company B, not necessarily a more successful production company or a less successful production company, assume that they were sort of at the same place, and you might get a completely different reaction. And what began to drive me crazy was the random nature of, I'm calling, equal production companies, and one is, pushing me away, and the other is welcoming me with open arms. But I guess the sort of the way to look at that as a cup is half full situation is the fact that people are really, really, there's 8 bazillion junior executives that are looking for the project that will make their career, and if you can sort of convince them that the project that you have is that project, you're absolutely going to get a warm reception. But I'm curious, that's my perception of it. I'm curious about how you guys feel about that. Larger the company, the more likely you are to get turned away. Is that kind of the way it works?
Yeah, I think if for no other reason, I do a lot of work, probably much more of my work is in reality than in scripted, but in the reality space, there are so many different, we'll call them independent, they're not affiliated with a big studio, so many different players in that space. If you were to go to a well-established major studio, so to Devin's point a little, they're structured, and there's this department, that department, this department, senior vice president, director, manager. They all have their little method of doing business, and it's hard to. It's all their job is really to convince their boss, who needs to convince their boss, who needs to convince their boss. But if you go to these smaller reality companies, they don't have this whole phalanx of development executives. There's often, sometimes you can deal directly with the principal of a company. Phil Gurran, for example, very well-known producer. It's his company. He's been around for 30 years. He does all sorts of stuff. He has development people, but if Phil likes it, it gets on the air, or it gets made, or it gets optioned. So the point is that the big studios sometimes can't get out of their own way because they have too many development execs and too much of an approval process internally. So the smaller companies are by nature much more nimble, able to make a decision quickly. And to David's point, you may get a warm reception someplace and a cold reception someplace else. It's in the smaller independents. If you get a warm reception, there's very few impediments, or there's far fewer impediments to going to the next step to get an offer and get a deal made than there is when you deal with a Sony or a Warner Brothers.
Mark, when you're evaluating a project, are you looking at different criteria than might be the case if you were doing some version of what you were doing at a major studio or a major conglomerate? You're at a small independent social media company.
Yeah, it's actually it's a marketing company. Yeah, what we do is a little bit different. It's basically digital marketing, like an ad agency, and so when we're working with cable channels, whether it's FX, where we're essentially their digital agency of record, or I recently worked with Game Show Network, and it's kind of an interesting case. They created this show called the American Bible Challenge. I don't know if anyone here has watched the show yet. It's maybe more of a red state kind of show than a California show. But Jeff Foxworthy is the host. We saw 2 pilots, and it is the most successful launch in Game Show Network history and GSN history. And what we created for it was an app that is for tablet and mobile. As for iOS, I can't remember if we did the Android version as well. And essentially, it's a game that has Bible questions and mirrors what the show does. And I think what's kind of interesting about it, and I think that could be a lesson if you're pitching something, if you have other add-ons that could also be value generators for the network. This is kind of a great example, because the reason that it was made, and it was kind of it wasn't a cheap game to make, is that they got the Salvation Army to sponsor it. So all the costs were completely paid for. And what they were really looking for was X number of plays, which somehow became X number of downloads, which is, of course, going to be a smaller number than number of plays. And, we blew it out of the water. I mean, it's well beyond that. And I think that's just an example of how things are changing now. And I'm sure there's been other panels here about transmedia. I think we were on one before. But I think it's an example of where your idea, you can bring more to the table.
This notion of how you can sort of basically generate your own audition, what Stuart was talking about, the idea that you can, if you have a something to say or some sort of interesting point of view, you can make a video in your office and put it up on YouTube, and you will be on a distribution platform, and you won't completely have to be in the pitch mode. You'll be you will have legitimized what it is that you've got to say. It feels to me as sort of the essence of where we are in the media landscape in 2012 and sort of what this entire conference is about. And I'm just sort of curious as to, if you're sort of trying to break into the business in some form or another, does it simply make sense to do it that way? It feels to me like that's the version of, at some point, Chris Nolan makes Batman movies now for hundreds of millions of dollars, but he started out making a small independent film. It feels to me like that's sort of from a filmmaker's point of view or from a producer's point of view. like Lisa said, you go through the doors that are open, you do the thing that's most accessible and easiest and almost by definition cheapest, and then you sort of let that project push you forward in your career. And I'm curious how you guys look at that.
Well, I wanted to tell a story real quick about how, there's the infamous employee that works in the mailroom at an agency, and I've never actually met that person, or I thought they were like the unicorn, they were mythical. But we actually are in the middle of setting up a guy that works in one of the big talent agencies right now. He did his script, and he got it in front of the right people, and we're steps away from setting it up at a network right now. So it happens. So if you guys are writers, out there, just be aware that there are so many avenues for you to do things like that. Just get it out there. Just write it and get it out there. That's my advice.
And I do agree with you, David. Is it mostly producers in the audience? I'm assuming it is, but can you, by show of hands, are you mostly producers? Who are the rest of you guys? One person yell what you do. Writer? Directors? Actors?
Filmmakers.
What did you say?
Filmmaker.
Okay, filmmaker. Okay, good. All right, so I got a little bit of sense. But, we have a lot of clients who come to us with a great idea. They say we have this idea, and as one of you guys said before, ideas are cheap, and you really need to spend the time. It's just like starting any other business. If you want the people to come to your store to buy clothes, you have to fill it up with clothes. If you want someone to buy your script or buy your idea, you really have to create that and make it so that they can visually see it and understand it. And putting together a 2 or 3 minute reel, I do think, is invaluable if you have the resources to do that, because you can write a script. One thing, people won't read necessarily the whole script, but you give them 2 or 3 minute link to something, they're much more likely to actually watch that, and then they get a look and feel and a taste of what you're trying to create. And I think that's very, very helpful. But it really is putting that step forward and creating that business and then selling it, and understanding that you are looking for investors, basically, regardless if it's a studio or a website or whatever it is, you're looking for someone to invest in what your dream is. And so it can't just be an idea that you scribble down on paper with like a picture. It really needs to be something fleshed out that a real business person is going to be interested in, because although the content needs to be amazing, the person who you're selling it to needs to be assured as much as they can that this is going to be successful. So I think that's just really important to put your best foot forward and really create something substantial and good to sell.
Yes.
A question probably mainly for you, David, but in talking about GSM doing the game show, and we're talking about the add-on of the app which is that. Real Intelligent Real, which of course does the show, Carbaugh, who does that show. How, in a situation for producers that is becoming more and more of a work for hire, where you're not getting any part of your IP on an original program, how does that work in being able, are you just saying that by adding on that app, being able to walk in there and saying, I have a linear program and I also have a digital side to that, it's just, the digital side just helps you get that deal? And how do you hang on to any of that digital IP?
Well, you might have to talk more about how you actually hang on to that digital IP.
or how you don't hang on to it. But go on, and I'll
yeah,
follow.
no, I just think that there's, the world has exploded, and it's just, even in the past 12 months, it feels so different than it was 12 months ago. And so, all these studios and a lot of production companies have digital arms or digital staff that are, or digital marketing, and their job is to get more, is to find other ways to exploit across other media, because TV's terrified. I mean, everyone's zipping through commercials, people are cutting the cord, getting Apple TV, Xbox, Xboxes. I mean, it's the next version of Apple TV. God knows what's going to happen when that comes out. Really choosing what you want. So anything you can do to kind of make your idea as kind of as big as possible and places to use it. And then the other thing about this in particular is the idea, and this started, a few years ago I was at an agency. We were doing something for a soap opera that shot in New York, and they had a perfume that they created on the show, and then that perfume they also sold at JCPenney's. And it was the second time they were doing it, and this time they wanted an ad, and so we actually went and we shot an ad with some stars, and very inexpensively, kind of white psych background, but it was great, you know. And what that was my first encounter with marketing having to be a profit center. So when you're talking about something like, you know, an add-on for Game Show Network for a show, the fact that it got completely paid for by a sponsor, I don't know if they actually made a profit on it or not. They might have had some number that if they hit, they actually got more money. I mean, who knows? But what you're seeing more and more is that the marketing divisions of television companies, studios, are becoming profit generators themselves. That they're selling cups, they're selling T-shirts from HBO, and there always seems to be a deal on some Game of Thrones material, merchandise.
How do you hang on to a part of that IP? Is it just given that you're not, if you walk in, you're now, it's a work for hire model, it's no longer 10% of the budget, it's no longer PPP, choose between the two. It's really taking content producers to a point that you really want to go overseas and sell your stuff and then bring it back in.
Right, I think that's true, and I think there's always an instinct, especially as a business becomes a little bit more mature. So in cable in the beginning, nobody seemed to care that much about holding on to rights. Buyers did not seem to care so much about holding on to rights. In the same way that broadcast networks, when television first started, didn't seem to care about holding on to rights. And then as these businesses mature, everybody sort of gets the idea if they're paying money and they're a buyer, they want to hold on to the rights, and so they ask for more and more and more and more. And the good news, and that's the bad news, and there is that instinct on the part of media companies, and even not such big media companies, but certainly major media companies, to acquire intellectual property and not part with it under any set of circumstances. And it, you know, takes 17 people in the mix of those large organizations to ultimately pass off, and you simply don't get there. That's the bad news. The good news is that sometimes if you're an actor for hire on a television series, it's a work for hire situation. You didn't create your role. You may add a line of dialogue or a tweak here or there, but the likelihood is that you're performing in somebody else's production, and you're simply not going to control those rights. But anytime you actually generate something or create something, it seems to me that you're in a position to say, this is mine, I'm selling it to you, and I'm willing to sell it to you for all the things that you want to do with it. But, I might like to hold on to the right in my hometown of Waterloo, Iowa, to put it on as a community theater at some point, and I'd like to have that right. And you probably aren't going to exercise the theme park rights to it because it's not that kind of a property, so I'd like to hold on to those. And I'm sure you don't do business in Bulgaria, so I'd like to sort of hold that back as well. And the point, I'm sort of exaggerating to make the point, but I think whenever you create something and it's your intellectual property and you're giving it up, you always have the right to say to somebody, I'm willing to give this to you, but I need to carve out a couple of things. And once you begin to do that, then I think you're in a much better position. I think that people in the reality business have figured out that if you can sell it somewhere before you bring it into NBC or USA, they look at it differently. They regard it. It's a different kind of situation, and it reflects itself in the deal that you make. And I've also been amazed, and this was well into cable, where sometimes you sell sort of a show that doesn't exactly fit in a network. There isn't really an established business model, and you ask for things that you simply don't think you're going to get in terms of reserving rights, and lo and behold, you actually get them. So I'm not saying I'm not being wildly optimistic about it or naive about what buyers of intellectual property want, and at the same time, sometimes you actually end up, if you can sort of play that game of chess properly, you end up better at the end of the game than you might think. And it's sort of a generic answer to the question, but I think that once you create something, you have the right to talk, to look at it as something other than I'm either going to sell this to you outright or not. You can actually say I'm going to sell part of this to you, but these are the rights that I need to hold on to, and sometimes you end up better off than you think.
There's also, just to add on to that, I have a client actually who was going crazy acquiring digital content, and his model was, I'm not going to pay these guys anything, but everything's 50-50. So down the road, because this was a couple of years ago, so it was the industry was a little more nascent than it is now, and they didn't really know. They didn't know how to monetize it, and the hope was they'd get a web series and they would bring it onto TV or make it a feature. And that was his model. And he said, you know what, whatever happens with this, we're going to be partners in it. And so there are companies who do that type of thing, smaller companies. And a lot of the times, though, it is limited to profit participation, where they still do want the rights to hire someone else to do writing and to do that other stuff. But at least you'd be involved financially if the show is a hit. So you're not just taking a one-time fee for your IP and then that's it.
In just one sec, the one thing I would say is that the thing that's sort of interesting about who's in the audience today is that if you're a writer or a producer or a filmmaker, what you all have in common is that you're generating the intellectual property as opposed to performing somebody else's intellectual property. And I think that morally and in some ways legally and practically gives you rights, potentially at least, that you might not otherwise have. And it feels to me that if you start, if you start looking at what you've created as having 1,000 pieces to it, even if you have to give up 900 of them, you may still hold on to 100 of those, and they're important. So,
my frustration is when I go in and do a lot lately, especially on the cable side, they're coming back, business fairs coming back and going, we want to guarantee you the first season as a production company. We're liable, you on our contract, you do the pilot, and if we don't, then we can switch it over to anybody else we want.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's the ultimate embarrassment of having original property and walking in and going, at the end of the day, they can kick my production company out of the door.
Yeah, I actually just made a deal for someone representing the company that was in exactly that position, and theoretically, if it all sort of goes bad, they can be bought out of their idea for the pilot fee, which was literally about $3,000 or less at a small cable network. And that's a little bit of a different situation, quite honestly, than holding on to some of these rights, maybe in overseas markets or in domestic markets that aren't quite mature yet. It's a problem, and I understand why it's frustrating, and I wish I had. It's incredibly frustrating, actually. I think it's wrong. Most of this stuff is kind of just a negotiation, but at some point, when you can take somebody's idea away, when they walk in the door with an original idea, and you can take it away for a couple of $1,000s, even though it's probably not going to happen, and you always have the right to sort of raise your hand and scream about it. It just feels to me like that is not the way that this business should be functioning. It just does. But anyway, right there.
Yeah, along the same lines as what Conrad was asking. I'm a producer with a production company, and I have similar experiences. In fact, I wish you were head of business affairs at the network because you seem very fair.
Well, if I was, though, I wouldn't be. So.
So when you go in and you pitch an idea that's yours, you even have tape that you've invested in, and they want to buy it, if there isn't, if there aren't competing bids, and so you don't have a ton of leverage, it seems. I'm looking for advice from the Art of the Deal panel as to how to maintain the digital rights. Because I get it, it's the network's money, they're giving me however much to go produce a pilot or episodes, and they get to own it. I'm not putting up money, and they're paying me for my services. I understand that. But I think, a lot of producers with small companies are looking to the future of, okay, well, we all see it, it's the digital space to expand to, and I'm wondering if you guys have any advice on how to really maintain those digital rights. Because I've been in situations where the network doesn't even do anything with them.
Mm-hmm. We represent a lot of people like you, and I think the thing you have to do is just you ask. You ask early on. This is what's really important, and this is really a deal breaker for her. So just have it on the table initially. And sometimes you're successful and sometimes you're not, and then it's just a question with yourself, okay, is this a good enough deal where I'm willing to give this up, or should I say no? You have to create, in our office, we call it our wish, want, walk. So when you go into a deal, you have what your wish is, no holds barred, whatever, not looking at the market, not looking at anything else, what you really, really want. Your want is your want, what the market dictates and where you'll probably end up, and then your walk point. And if your walk point, if one of the elements of your walk point is I need to maintain the digital rights, then you need to have the ability in a lot of different respects of that word to say, okay, I'm not going to do this deal. But you have to ask. We ask for that kind of stuff all the time. I get invited to the lawyer all the time. That's not standard. That's not standard. That's not standard. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I do not represent standard. I represent independent producers, and nothing's really standard. And so we're willing to try to negotiate and make things change. And, we do. We've had success with Showtime getting rights back, and we've had success with other networks and bigger companies holding back certain rights and retaining them. And it's just a matter of asking, I think. And then if they don't love your project, they'll probably say no. If they love your project, they very well may say yes.
And to your point about sometimes the networks don't use them, it's one thing, particularly in a big studio, if you're going in and saying, I want to control the publishing rights, digital rights, your that wish list that Lisa was talking about, they must say no to that, unless it's a really compelling reason. But if you really start to walk through it and pay a little more attention and say to them, well, okay, I understand why from a corporate mandate you must control the print publication rights. I can live with that. But if you don't exploit them for the first 3 years after the show's been on the air, I either want them back or I want a bigger participation or we'll do it as a joint venture. So you have to know the other guy, the other side. And yeah, if it's Disney, if it's Sony, they're not going to give you those rights. But again, if you tie it to the way they may choose to exploit those rights in the future or not. In other words, don't make it a black and white, who controls these rights? Well, you control them, but I can get them back under all these different circumstances. And if they are going to exploit them and you get a piece of that, that's fine. It may not be as good as you exploiting it directly, but at least it's being exploited and at least you're being paid. What is the most frustrating, as you said, is if they're controlling all these buckets of rights and not exploiting them.
I actually had a client who we were doing a deal with Warner Brothers for a documentary film she did, and she really wanted to maintain the rights. Initially it was digital rights, and it was like, okay, well, what do you actually want? And what she actually wanted, she wanted the ability to sell the DVD on her website and to download the DVD from, not a commercial, not iTunes or something like that, but other places like that. And we actually were able to carve that out. It took me probably 3 or 4 times to read through the Warner Brothers agreement to figure out if they actually gave that to us, but they did. They actually carved those things out because that was important to her, and they realized that it wasn't a big deal on their business model. So even with the big company, we were able to make that headway, but we did have to be very specific and very limited in what we wanted.
I actually have a question, Lisa, for you. So obviously if you haven't made it yet and you're pitching in order to get the production funds, that's one thing. But it sounds like you work with some filmmakers who actually have you're selling something that's already been made.
Right.
If a filmmaker or a producer, TV maker, whatever it is, already exploits in some way on digital, does that help the cause or does that hurt the sale?
Both. I think it's the same thing where our experience is that there are certain rights that are already exploited or already taken. The studio is willing to carve those out because they're simply not available. And, if it's a really good product, I feel like it helps. Some people take the viewpoint that it doesn't help that market's been exploited. We do a lot of split rights deals, too, and if you're Showtime and your window is third, you're just not going to get as much money as if the Showtime window was first. So, I guess it tends to hurt the deal in terms of finances, how much you're going to get if it's already been exploited.
Yes.
I have just a quick comment, which is that if you have a Writers Guild writer involved, no matter what your contract says, if you're a producer and you've been bought property or actually if you're hiring that writer to write, they already have some reserved rights. So although on new media you can negotiate a fee for them, there are rights that that writer retains. And very similar in some circumstances as the model that Stu was talking about, where if you don't exploit within a certain period and so on. I just wanted to put that out there, that there are some risks associated with some of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the point that Stu made is also, if you don't look at it as a zero-sum thing, zero-sum situation, it's quite reasonable to say these are yours unless you completely don't do anything with them. And even if you can't achieve that, you know, nowhere does it say that you can't make a deal with someone and then 18 months later go and say, look, I know that you control these rights, but I want to put it up on community theater in Iowa, or, you know, I've got this connection in Bulgaria and you guys aren't doing anything in Bulgaria, or whatever it is. You know, the ability, to me, it's like the negotiation doesn't end forever just because you make a deal. You make a deal, you document it, circumstances change, relationships change, you're doing 3 other projects with the same company or whatever. And, you know, the idea of looking at this as this kind of continuing fluid situation that is infused by your relationships and your stature in the business and, you know, where you're making money and opportunities and all sorts of different things. I think that the critical thing is to not look at this, any of these situations, as if they're black and white, because they're only black and white until you get somebody to say, well, okay, maybe we'll think about doing it that way. So, any other questions? Yes.
The only thing I wanted to address was the subject of profit participation, because while it does sound appealing as somebody who was a profit participant for many, many years, I think it's really, it may feel good to become a profit participant, but your likelihood of receiving any money from profit participation is virtually nil. And you have to be Don Johnson or Art Buchwald or somebody of that stature to go after the companies about profit participation, and it will take you years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to, I mean, I got profit statements that didn't have millions of dollars given from foreign co-producers. So, you know, it feels nice, but I think retaining the kinds of rights that you're describing is a much better strategy than asking for profit participation.
What I would say, I'd like to, I'm sure 90% of the people in the room know this, the Louis C.K. analogy, you know. Put his stuff, I thought that was Susan. What you say is perfectly, you know, it's just that's the way it is at a big studio, and that's why they have 50-page profit definitions, and that's why lawyers get paid to do battle on that battlefield. But in this sort of digital delivery age, the revenue stream is much cleaner. If you are, you know, Louis C.K. and you go put up your stand-up and say, hey, I forget if you charged $4.99 or $5.99, you're going to get a statement 30 days in. This is how, here's our download fees. Yes, yes, and they may take a 10% fee.
I
or
love that model.
Yep.
That model's gorgeous, but that's not being a profit participant. That's being an owner.
Well, but if you, let's say you worked with Louis C.K. If so, the key is to not necessarily have your profit participation be with Warner Brothers or Sony. Now that cuts out a lot of the world, but the fact is that these digital revenues that we're talking about are much more easily monetized and documented and audited and regulated. So you're not playing that game of foreign sales agents in Botswana.
I think we're just about done. Any other questions? Maybe if we've got 2 minutes, why don't we just go down the panelists? Stu, why don't we start with you? Words of advice, optimistic if possible.
Sure. Optimistic, like, you know, some of it I've shared, I think, in the digital space, and because it's Digital Hollywood, I'm focusing on that. It is not as hard to get an agent. It's not as hard to find the money, to track the money, because they're digital downloads. AT&T made $3.99. But what I would say in terms of a real art of the deal type advice, the art of the deal for me has really, I'm not one of those guys who has a chart and a strategy and this is how I'm going to do this negotiation. To me, the art of the deal is to find out what the other side doesn't necessarily care so much about, you know, to your point about rights. And you may occasionally be surprised that that's exactly the things that your client resonates with, whether it's screen credit or holding back certain rights or the ability to have his mother come in as an assistant. You know, find something on the other side that they don't care about. There are plenty of big deals where you find the people on the other side maybe are not strong in foreign distribution, so they're more willing to give that up, or they don't have a video distribution arm, or they don't have a book publishing arm. Find what the other side doesn't care about and use that as currency to get what you do care about.
Mark?
I guess my biggest piece of advice is to be as inventive as possible in as many ways as possible. I mean, this is a golden age in terms of new forms of distribution. I mean, not everybody has Louis C.K.'s following. He did become a millionaire in 12 days with his video download. But there are ways to get your work out there. One of my, last weekend, my 9-year-old was watching Annoying Orange on Cartoon Network, which I thought was a web series, but evidently has just become a TV series as well. And so it's just an example of how something transferred from one medium to the other. And I don't know what deal they did, but I'm assuming they retained a lot of rights.
Devin?
Just, be smart, make good decisions for yourself. Try to surround yourself with good people that know what they're doing as well, and fake it till you make it. That's it.
I think for me, aside from the ability and willingness to walk away from something that doesn't feel right, is to be nice. It's like you cross paths with the same people all the time, and relationships really do matter. And if people like you, they're more willing to look at your stuff. And it's easier to break in the door and to continue a good career if you're nice.
I would just say that I actually think it is a golden age now, in the sense that there's, the mass market is sort of fragmented. It's quite niche oriented. But the good news is that creative people, artists, actually have more control over sort of the means of production and the means of distribution than they ever did before, simply for the reasons that we were talking about. You can make a film very inexpensively. Look at Blair Witch, look at Paranormal. In every form of media, books, music, you have much more control over distribution of your own product than you ever did before. And that's extraordinary. I mean, that, I think, is really almost as revolutionary, maybe in some ways more so, from an artist's point of view, than the invention of the printing press or some massively important technological advance. The idea that you can sort of create a community for yourself and a fan base without spending any form of money and without having a media executive or a producer say yes to you, the idea that you have control of that yourself is an amazing thing. So as fragmented as it is and as difficult as it is, it actually seems to me that these are the good old days. So, and I think that's it. Let's have a round of applause for our panel.